Yes.
Showtime.
Showtime. Okay. Welcome to Readercon 31. The panel tonight here, the first of a panel, I think one of the first panels of the evening, is the Legacy of Ballantine books. I'm the moderator, Alan Steele. We have two very good guests here with us. Two of our guests apparently are no-shows. Patrick and Teresa Nielsen Hayden haven't shown up yet. If they do, they're welcome to jump right in. But in the meantime, the rest of us will soldier on as best as we can. To introduce the other members of our panel, one is Gary Wolfe, who is a Hugo-nominated critic, and I guess you're the chief reviewer at Locus. I guess it's safe to say.
Well, the oldest one anyway. That's
yes. You're the old China hand, and he's also emeritus professor of humanities at Roosevelt University, and essayist, critic, anthologist. Edited, I believe, the Modern Library, recent Modern Library reissues of books.
The Library of America.
Library of America, issue of that. And also the Joey Zone. I've always loved the Joey Zone. He's an illustrator. He's the creator of the Readercon logo. And among other things, he's involved with the Lovecraft Arts and Sciences Council of Providence, Rhode Island. And as I said, my name is Alan Steele. I'm a novelist, SF writer. I've won 3 Hugos, have published a lot of science fiction over the last 33 years. My 25th novel will be coming out later this year. So anyway, first we'll read you the description, that is the official description of the panel. From its founding in 1952, Ballantine books put significant genre works such as The Space Merchants and Fahrenheit 451 into print. Its gorgeously adorned Ballantine adult fantasy series, started in 1969, fostered rediscovery of many foundational works of modern fantasy, Blood in the Mist, The King of Elfland's Daughter, among with contemporary originals like The Last Unicorn. It brought the authorized edition of The Lord of the Rings to America. What debt does SF owe to the power couple Ian and Betty Ballantines, and how does that legacy persist? Joey, this is a good time for you to show our
this
people.
Is Betty and Ian right here.
Mm-hmm.
This is from the Norriscon 3 program guide, where they were guests of honor at the time.
I had the pleasure of meeting very briefly Betty Ballantine, waiting for breakfast at a restaurant. Robin Silverberg introduced us. She was a very gracious lady, and I was absolutely awestruck. I usually don't get like that, but I mean, I was literally, my tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth, did not know what to say, because I realized that this was talking to somebody who, there's about 5 or 6 people to whom science fiction, modern science fiction in the 20th century owes its existence. And I would think it's safe to say that the Ballantines are 2 of them. They very briefly, the Ballantine books, it wasn't the first paperback SF publisher. They were preceded by Pocket Books published their first SF book in 1942. Dell published their first one in 1949, and Bantam, which the Ballantines were instrumental in co-founding, published their first one in 1950. But Ballantine line was the first. It was the first line first paperback imprint to actually devote itself to regularly publishing science fiction as a line, and from the very get-go, their books were very different. Let me show you for instance, their very first publication, the very first book that they published, was an anthology. It was the Star Science. It was the first volume of the Star Science Fiction series. This was the beginning of a 6 or 7 volume series. No one up until this time had done original anthologies. They were the first. And it had a good start to it because one of the stories in here was an acknowledged classic, The 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke. Their first novel, which was published just a few months later, was again another book that became a classic, The Space Merchants by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. This is again the original printing of the thing. This cover, like most of their books, also like the Star Science Fiction, was done by Richard Powers, and they looked different from everything else that had been done before. They did not look like pulps. They did not. They up until that time, the predominant look of science fiction books was either looking straight like pulp magazines, very garish, or there was this kind of Art Deco sort of minimalist style. You know, maybe like a gray globe with a stylized rocket or something like that. They did neither. The covers were colorful, and they struck right out. And going from there, they, for a good 20, 25 years or so, they were one of the leaders, if not the leading SF publisher. They were the ones that brought in a lot of interesting innovations that I think fundamentally changed science fiction publishing from here on out. So I'll throw it to you guys. Gary, what's your 2 cents on this?
Well, I grew up reading these things, and I distinctly remember as a kid, Ballantine was the first publisher I could identify by publisher. And it was primarily because of those Richard Powers covers, which were almost abstract paintings, except frequently there'd be a tiny human figure in them and put things in perspective. And they would do experimental things. There was a collection of stories by Arthur C. Clarke called Reach for Tomorrow, where the cover was printed sideways.
I've got that right here, in fact.
Because exactly, and that's kind of a bold thing to do, and it's very much a typical Powers cover as well.
I've only seen this done I'm a paperback collector. I've only seen this done 2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And the back cover is the same way.
Yeah.
I think
they didn't do it more because I assume that it doesn't look that well on spin racks.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's difficult to do. I mean, the rest of the book reads, loath to open this up all the way because these are uncracked copies. But these are, I mean, as you see, the print face is the same way. Another thing that they did that was interesting, and they didn't do this for very long, but it was that some of these early books had simultaneous hardcover impressions also.
Yeah, they did that from 56 to 58, 52 to 58, I think they did that.
Yeah, they did. Like, I'll show you one again. Arthur C. Clarke, here's the paperback of Expedition to Earth. And at the very same time, in fact, I found this at a Readercon dealer's room a few years ago, they did it in hardcover as well. And some of these are insanely valuable. Here is here's the first paperback printing of Fahrenheit 451. I found this in it was amazing. I found this in a box in an attic of unsorted paperbacks in an attic of a used bookstore in outside St. Louis that was going out of business, and they were just practically giving away the books. And I bought this thing, and this is again another virgin copy, unread, and I bought it for $3. There is a hardcover edition of these things, and the last time I saw one go for auction, it was around $15,000. It's one of the most valuable SF hardcovers around.
One of the pieces of trivia I learned from Betty Ballantine when I spent a lot of time with her, really at a World Fantasy, I guess, in Saratoga Springs, that book was actually discovered by one of their editors at the time, was Stanley Kaufman, who later became much better known as the film critic of the New Republic and a film scholar and film historian. But he was working as an editor for them in 52, I guess.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about Fahrenheit 451.
Fahrenheit 451, yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole history behind that thing. He wrote the original short story, The Fireman. He intended to write for Colliers, and they recognized that the subject matter was, I hate to use the word problematic. It's such a cliche word.
Problematic word.
It's a problematic word. Yeah. But it was a risky word. They understood what the subtext of that story was about, and they didn't want to publish it. So it ended up being published in Galaxy, which is still a good place to publish it, but it wasn't a breakout story that Bradbury was intending. And then Bradbury, then, the story is that he wrote Fahrenheit 451 in Los Angeles Public Library on a coin-op typewriter. Yeah, he had to go in. I mean, he didn't have a typewriter of his own, so they had these coin-operated typewriters, and he'd go in there with a roll of nickels, and he'd have to sit there and plug nickels into the things, and that's how he wrote the book. He didn't have a typewriter of his own. There were a few of the other things that, I mean, they had this incredible beginning of things. Here's another one of their early ones. It's a legendary book, which is More Than Human.
Yeah.
And again, it's these amazing Powers covers on these. Here's another Bradbury. I got this one even for $1. This is the first of the October Country. I'm going to see if I can open this without damaging it, because the pages are just about to fall out.
Yeah, how do you pronounce, what is it, Joseph?
Unani is the way I always heard it.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 'cause he did the illustrations for that. And he did a bunch of illustrations for Bradbury in general and some of his hardcovers.
He's an incredible artist. You showed a minute ago another Bradbury, the illustrated, the collection of the comic versions.
Well, actually, no. This right here, I was going to ask you about this. This is Frank Frazetta, and this is totally pulp and totally,
yeah,
EC. And this is reprinting EC. Now they had another paperback that I couldn't find on my shelf if I still have it, called Tomorrow Midnight.
right.
That had a Frazetta cover, and that was reprinting the Bradbury EC stories, which EC basically adapted Bradbury, and then Bradbury called him up and said, it'd be nice to get credit. And
Yeah,
and they did. They worked it out. It was a selling point for both EC and Bradbury at the time.
And it was one of the few, but those, you're right. It's one of the few of the books that they published at the time that you could take one look at and say, yeah, that's science fiction. Their books, I mean, the other line at the time was Ace Books, and Ace Books got started a year later. And again, another major line, another one that was hugely influential. But every Ace book that came out during that time, the covers looked like that could have come straight off of the covers of Startling Stories or Planet Stories. They were very science fictional.
It was deliberate. Their characteristic artist was probably Ed Valigorsky.
Right, exactly.
And it's really just spaceships and aliens and planets. They wanted to go the opposite direction from the way the Ballantines were. Ballantines wanted to be literary. I mean, their first book actually was a business novel called Executive Suite, which later got made into a successful movie. So they wanted to look literary. They wanted to get away from that pulp look. And Wollheim, who grew up with it, wanted to go whole hog into that look. And that's
so you had two different approaches really going on. And then the others, I mean, there was Bantam, which, the Bantam line, was very science fictional looking. Avon, Dell, others. But they all looked like science fiction books. The Ballantine books really kind of stuck out in that way. They were fundamentally different. Here's another one which has got kind of an interesting history behind it. this isn't really science fiction, but I, Libertine
Uh-huh.
by Frederick R. Ewing. And now, this is actually Theodore Sturgeon writing under pseudonym. The
Is that
story,
Kelly Freas doing the cover for? Who is that doing the
that's
cover?
Kelly Freas. And
Kelly
it's
Freas.
one
Okay,
of the
good.
very few times that Kelly did a Ballantine cover. The story on, and now notice back cover, the Arthur photo in the back, and this is something else that Ballantine. That's
Happy guy.
that is Gene Shepard. That is that's the talk show host Gene Shepard.
Oh,
The story that is told here is that Gene Shepard, of course, in the early 50s, had a nationwide syndicated radio show.
Mm-hmm.
And he began talking about a book that he had read called Our Libertine. And he began talking about what a great, fantastic book this is. And, people ought to be reading this. By Frederick R. Ewing.
Right.
And there was no such thing. This book was a complete hoax. It was a fabrication. But people began going to bookstores asking for Our Libertine, and bookstores began putting in orders. And, the warehouses started coming back and saying, we don't know anything about this. Well, it's got to be out there. Gene Shepard, I heard about it on the Gene Shepard show. We got customers going to this. The Ballantines caught wind of this and decided to cash in on it. So they went to Ted Sturgeon, and they asked him if he could turn around a novel real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time, Sturgeon's output was hot or cold. He would either was one of the most prolific writers out there and could write like crazy, or he'd be totally blocked. And this is a time when he was not totally blocked. So he produced, and I understand it's like only took about 2 or 3 weeks to produce this thing. I've tried to read it. It is, I love Sturgeon dearly, but this is god awful. This is if Theodore Sturgeon could ever be said to have written a bad novel, this is it. But it's got that history.
Well, there's an even more bizarre story about Sturgeon that Betty told me that I've never read anywhere. He was very grateful to them because they had persuaded him to add a novella to make More Than Human into a novel.
Yeah.
Basically. And Betty had a lot to do. He was kind of their, if there was a staff writer, he was it. They'd had people that always depended with it. Early years of buying science fiction, they depended a lot on Fred Pohl to know who was who. They depended later on, of course, on Lynn Carter. But after More Than Human, Sturgeon became really grateful to them. So they had a lot of success with I, Libertine. And a few years later, I think probably 61 or so, Betty said she had a manuscript from who was at the time a very popular writer named Lucy Freeman. Lucy Freeman was a pop psychology writer who had become a New York Times reporter who began writing about, there's one of her books was Children Who Kill, about pathologies. She wrote a bestseller about depression. And she had written a book about a patient who was currently a patient at Bellevue, somebody who'd apparently gone bizarre in the Army. And there were all kinds of documents. The guy thought he was a vampire. And Freeman had written a book about this guy, and they bought it. And Betty thought it was really good, kind of scary, a little bit gruesome. And a couple of months, maybe 6 months before they were to publish this book by Lucy Freeman, Lucy called up and told Betty, you got to pull the book because this guy is being released from Bellevue and he knows where I live. And Betty said, well, what if I find somebody to write a fictionalized version of the same story? And Freeman apparently said, as long as it's not traceable to me, as long as you can't identify this guy, the story itself is pretty compelling. She turned to Ted Sturgeon, who wrote a novel which became Some of Your Blood.
Really? Really?
Yeah, that was a nonfiction book that they couldn't publish to protect the author.
Wow.
Whatever happened to that nonfiction book? Is it published somewhere?
I've tried to track it down. Lucy Freeman has been dead for decades. I assume her papers are somewhere. Betty didn't know where they were.
I mean, I've heard of the book Children Who Kill.
Yeah, and there was one called Fight Against Fears, which was really the first best-selling book about depression. So Freeman was a big name,
Yeah.
and they were happy to have her, but they figured, and to Betty's credit, she thought somehow Theodore Sturgeon and Psycho Guy from the Army would fit together really, and it's one of Sturgeon's more disturbing novels.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the books I almost brought in from the my collection is arranged by genre, and so I only picked up a couple of books from the horror shelf, and I almost brought that one over here, but I'm not going to run over there. Scott Edelman out in the audience made a comment here. I'm going to read it.
Okay.
Scott says, what Bradbury did to get credit for those EC adaptations was act not as if it was theft, but as if it was an oversight, and write the company to say that there must have been a slip up with the credit box and with the accounting department because his check hadn't yet arrived. That allowed Bill Gates to act as if it was indeed an error, as if payment was intended all along. Kind and wise way for Bradbury to approach the matter. Dozens of authorized adaptations followed. Thank you, Scott. That's
Scott knows his comics, that's for sure.
Go ahead, Joe. You haven't said much.
Well, I wanted to just bring up, you had mentioned the Ballantines and Lord of the Rings, and in back of me, I have this Come to Middle Earth poster by Barbara Remington. And
It used to be in dorms all over, all over America.
You could not go to a dorm without seeing that.
well, the thing was is that this was found in a building 20 minutes from here, an antique store, rolled up in a planter. How much for this? $1. Not framed though, not framed. The frame cost more and all this other stuff. But I just, I can talk more about Barbara Remington in a bit, but I did want to say that when Ace printed Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, they did a small version of Lord of the Rings, but they did not pay Tolkien a royalty.
Right.
And the Ballantines had their authorized royalty paying edition at a higher price. And they still outsold, and the Ace went out of print. True Confessions, I have the copies upstairs as well, because that's what you do. This article is written by Ian, and what is it? The cause caught the nation, and the Tolkien tide stepped forward. The Ace edition was obliterated. That's being generous.
Yeah, it was.
The Ace edition had taken advantage of a glitch. The American copyright on it had either never been filed or allowed to expire. So basically, any American publisher could have done what Walheim did at that point. And Betty, again, they went to England. And one of the things that she told me that Tolkien was upset, not just that he was obviously upset he wasn't getting royalties, but they had to really convince him that paperbacks weren't just awful. Because his idea of a paperback book were post-war British paperbacks, which looked even pulpier than American.
Yeah, they were awful.
And they were awful. And so he didn't want his books in paperback at all. But when they finally convinced him, you'll make a lot of money, he sort of said, oh, okay.
Yeah, and he really did not like Barbara Remington.
No, he did not. He did not.
For the thing, he made comments about the fruit here in this poster. It's not the full range, but there was a lion. He said there are no lions on Middle Earth. I don't know. I haven't reread the Silmarillion recently, so maybe there are. I will say props to Barbara Remington, because before Tolkien forgot that Middle Earth was in New Zealand, and here are emus courtesy of Peter Jackson. Remington's great. I actually liked her. I grew up reading this. They have a Battle of Hastings type of mural effect. She also did the books for E.R. Edison, and I'm holding this one up right here.
Oh, yes.
Which Edison, for anybody who hasn't read them, is just, think of Nordic sagas. And manticores and demon lords and
Last, last year during the lockdown, I rediscovered heroic fantasy. I hadn't really been paying attention to it for many, many years. And I kind of, I wanted pure escapism. So first I found Conan, then I went and read all of Robert E. Howard. And then I read all of Michael Moorcock's Elric. Then I discovered Carl Edward Wagner. And a number of other people. God help me, I discovered Thongor. One book was enough. But I've got the Edison books, and they're stacked up. They're ready to go. But they look pretty daunting.
They're not easy. It's
Not easy reading.
Worm is not an easy read, but it's the most heroic one, and the others are a little more like Virginia Woolf. They're great. They're of a piece, and
I know I'm gonna have to get on here. The this is an interesting segue, because another thing that the Ballantines did, and this was in the '60s, was that they launched. I'm not sure if the Lord of the Rings and the Edison books were the first of it, or what, but they also launched the adult fantasy program, which Lynn Carter edited. And I'll show us, because they brought a number, like Tolkien, like Edison, they brought into print a number of books that a lot of people, authors that people had either not heard of or hadn't heard of in a generation. They brought back, Lord Dunsany, and just about everything that Lord Dunsany published was of theirs. These have become incredibly scarce. I bought these last year during my binge, and it's ridiculous what you have to pay for these now. Clark Ashton Smith's books. They published 4 of these. We mentioned in passing a Readercon favorite, Blood in the Mist. And I think you had another couple there, Joey, that you showed off.
Okay, so one of the things I read pre this panel was that people have pretty much figured out that there is the series of the Ballantine adult fantasy, the Sign of the Unicorn, as Lynn Carter would say. And then there's the precursors, which were all the Tolkien stuff and the Edison books. But then also Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy was part of it.
And the Voyage to Arthur.
Yeah, and and yes, here we go.
Just as a kind of parentheses, since Betty didn't get as much credit as she should have, most of these were chosen by Betty. Lynn Carter didn't come on.
He was just an editorial consultant, correct?
Yeah, he wasn't even a consultant then.
Oh, wow.
He'd written a book.
That's interesting, because it's always been laid as to his credit that he was the guy who picked him out and so forth. And you're saying he wasn't.
No, he wasn't. He'd written a book about Tolkien. He wrote a book called, I think, A Look Behind the Lord of the Rings, which the Ballantines liked a lot. And that came out probably '68 or so. So they started talking to him about what other books he'd choose. But before he came along, they had done all the Edison books. They had done the Peter Beagle, The Last Unicorn. They had done all the Tolkien books. They had done the Mervyn Peake books. They had done
Arcturus, and basically they had done the other Fine and Private Place by Peter Beagle too.
Right, exactly. So Edison, not Edison. Carter came on, and basically, and he in his own book, which I'm sure you both have here.
Yeah. Right here.
Everybody has. And in the afterward, he's not claiming credit for anything before he came on. He says these other precursors were really Betty's work, and Betty originally got turned on to that, apparently even by Fred Pohl, even though he was a science fiction guy. But they had this little community of people, Sturgeon and Pohl and that sort of thing, that they would talk to about what books they ought to be reading. And after Carter had written the Lord of the Rings book, then they invited him to come up with other titles. And he came up with what became the official Ballantine adult fantasy series, which began with, let's see, Land of Unreason by Fletcher Pratt and Sprague de Camp.
Yeah. You know, and it sort of spun off from there also was the readers was H.P. Lovecraft, and they brought out the first uniform series of H.P. Lovecraft. And this was, again, it's such a departure because the other Lovecraft books that were published by that time were Lancer, which had probably the ugliest, covers ever. These out of focus plastic skulls, and surrounded by flames and stuff like this. And then you had these, which were just.
The one thing about Dream Quest was when you were at that time, bear in mind that this was in the late 60s, early 70s. It's not like today where you could find Lovecraft online, obviously, or around a lot. So you would be picking up stuff and then you'd go down and say, okay, it's Lovecraft and there's all these kitties here.
Yeah.
But the more you read Lovecraft, it's all about the kitties, especially in Kadath. So yeah, and I just wanted to bring up one of the big artists for the adult fantasy, and that would have been Gervasio Gallardo. This is the book right here. I'm trying to get a good close-up for someone. This is his painting for The Last Unicorn.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And he has a very bejeweled look to his work. There were 65, if you count the precursors, there were like 83 titles. And of those 83, 25 of the covers are by Gallardo.
Wow.
And the majority, I have seen the original for the Hannes Bach, what is it? The blue flamingo.
No, Blue Star, the blue
pagoda or something like that.
Yeah.
But I've seen the original for that, and it's not big. He painted a lot of these things. So they're almost like Persian miniatures, slightly bigger. For anybody who wants to see one of the very last adult fantasy covers, original art by Gallardo, it's for the book Excalibur. And that is being now shown at the Norman Rockwell Museum as part of their Enchanted fantasy art exhibit.
Another question that comes out of the audience here, in fact, comes from our host, Lisa Herschel, says, how did the Ballantines get started in publishing? How did they first start publishing science fiction? I know that they were with Bantam, and I don't think they started by themselves Bantam book, but they were instrumental in that.
They started in the late 30s importing Penguin books to the United States. That was the idea. Betty was raised, what's that island in the Channel that was taken over by the Nazis during the war? She had to, there was one Channel island that belonged to Britain. Yeah. Everybody knows what it is, but she had
India or something, or a part of India at the time.
Well, she was born in India in the Raj. Then she was a child in this island, and then she escaped by going away with Ian. And Ian had this idea to persuade Penguin books to market in the United States. So in 1939, 1940, they started Penguin Books USA. First of all, imports, and then reprinting other books. And they stayed with Penguin. I may be getting the dates wrong because I haven't looked it up. Pretty much through the war. And at the end of that period, Bantam was trying, I forgot who it was, who the publisher was. But Bantam wanted to compete with pocketbooks. Pocketbooks, for most of the war years, had cornered the market on paperbacks. So Bantam began, 45, 46 or something like that. And they had published a couple of early Bantam, when they were editing it, science fiction collections, except they weren't marketed as science fiction. There's an anthology by Judith Merrill called Shot in the Dark. Yeah,
you have to look inside to realize that's not a mystery.
On the cover, it says a different kind of mystery thrill.
Yeah, exactly.
You open it up. And then I'm not exactly sure why they left Bantam, but they wanted to have their own imprint. But they clearly were involved with the science fiction world in the late 40s. And then they started their own publishing. The actual Ballantine,
which is very forward-looking. I mean, at this time, it's hard to remember when there really wasn't science fiction as a regular staple in bookstores. And when they started it up, there was the major publishers weren't touching it except only very rarely. It was mainly a small press phenomena, small publishers like Gnome Press, Fantasy Press, and so forth. So for them to start this was, forgive the pun, a shot in the dark. It was, there's a lot to be said for that. One of the other innovations that I think that they found, I was looking through my collection, was that I think they were the first people to also do uniform editions, where they would reissue an author's books and put together as a series, usually with the same artist. For instance, here's Hal Clement, who used to be a Readercon regular. And these were, I can't remember the artist's name. I think it's Dean Ellis. Dean Ellis did these covers of his work. They did stuff like this also for Arthur C. Clarke. The Clarke ones, which were, in fact, the Clarke ones looked like Ellis, but they were actually done by Powers, and it was a very different look. It fools everybody.
Childhood's End is again another one of the classic covers, I think, that Powers did. But one of the other things I think that they did was that they were moving in a different direction from other publishers. And science fiction started showing up in New York mainstream publishers really in 1946 with Adventures in Time and Space, the big giant helium technology, and several Groff Conklin anthologies. These are like 500 and 600 page anthologies that appeared in the late 40s, almost entirely drawn from astounding science fiction. And there was another group of writers that the Ballantines had discovered, Bradbury being one of them, Sturgeon being one of them, Clarke being one, who were not necessarily the same stable of astounding writers that everybody else was publishing. In the 1950s, if you look at 50s paperbacks, Heinlein and Asimov were never published by Ballantine at all. But Sturgeon, Clarke, Bradbury.
Later they were.
Well, later they did, yeah.
In the 70s.
Yeah, but it was no longer Ballantine. The actual Ballantine era, we have to keep in mind, was basically 1952 when they started their imprint to 1973 when they sold it to Random House. And a couple of years after that, it basically became the
Del Rey? Is that
Del Rey books? Yeah,
Well,
Del Rey.
the other major program though of the 50s was the Signet program, and that's where Heinlein, Asimov, Murray Leinster, a lot of other writers were all coming out from there, and they had their own distinct look. And to be fair, they did some things over at Signet that were awfully interesting too. One of those Heinlein collections, The Man Who Sold the Moon, the very first edition of the thing, if you look in the back of it, is a form to fill out to get first tickets
to the moon.
To the first flight to the moon. I mean, which is how you can tell a genuine first of that particular paperback of that first, because it disappears after that. Here's another thing which I thought was an innovation. They did, and I don't think anybody else did this, talking about Arthur C. Clarke. Here is the first of Rendezvous of Romer, and I think they were the first to do the die-cut,
yeah,
where it opened up, and you'd see a larger one, and in fact would fold out to become a little mini poster.
Mm-hmm.
They did this. I think this was as I recall, this is the first time anybody did that. They did it again, and this is a kind of an interesting one. Here's one. It's now unfortunately forgotten, but it's Lester Del Rey's novel Nerves, which is one of the first novels to take seriously the prospect of a nuclear accident.
It was basically the China syndrome 30 years earlier.
Yeah, right, exactly. And he later, in the 70s, there was kind of a spate of novels about nuclear meltdowns that came about with the China Syndrome and 3 Mile Island. The first big novel of that was The Prometheus Crisis by Frank Robinson and Thomas Scotia. Well, Lester Del Rey rewrote Nerves.
Oh, I didn't know.
I mean, this is he rewrote his own book, which I think was the first time he did this. And again, they did the die cut cover, which folded out,
Mhm.
and so it had a scene from the novel in there. There was another one also. The most dramatic cover was one that showed an explosion of a plant. Uh, they published, it's astonishing when you are going through the shelf to see some of the things that they published that became classics. Here's The Wanderer, which was a Hugo Award winner, Fritz Leiber. First of Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey, which launched many sequels, and this eventually became New York Times best-selling series.
There's one thing about the Ballantine books, you showing it with the die cut, and I'm also thinking the Anne McCaffrey book, but even the Fritz Leiber stuff.
Mhm.
A lot of this is going from a pure art background. A lot of white, a lot of shiny, a lot of silver. It's not this dark, dingy. I mean, they did do some, but it's very bright and more artful in general than a lot of other things. And they would grab your attention, which they kind of had to do because I'm thinking just the adult fantasy books, but I think I saw some of the McCaffrey books and other books like this. There were no book chain bookstores then. There were, if you lived in a big city, maybe you had a good book. You had a good book. All the Ballantine adult fantasies, they came out, once a month, a couple new ones down at the medical pharmacy, where you could go down the aisle and buy a Men's Sweat magazine or one of those Erie publications or something like that, or a prosthetic limb. Take your pick.
Well, yeah.
It's a world that's completely lost. I mean, it's unfortunate, but the days that I could go to Green Hills drugstore, which is where I bought my my paperbacks, and buy a new novel by J.G. Ballard, for God's sake. I mean, it was 60 cents. They're gone. Comments here. Jeff at 8 says to Gary, is the island that you were talking about, is that Guernsey? Guernsey. Guernsey? Is that the name of the island that you were referring to?
Guernsey. Yes, it was the island of Guernsey. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So that confirms that.
Yeah.
And thank you, Kathy. She makes the comment, love this panel for bringing out the covers and artwork. Please share with the panel how much we appreciate you doing their homework. Kathy, it's my pleasure. Our pleasure. Going on. I think we're at about, we got at the 15-minute mark. I don't know if there's any other questions from the audience or anybody got anything that they want to.
I was going to say, though, that there's something that Joy had said about Signet books. They had a couple of signature artists. Also, Paul Lehrer was one of them that comes to mind. And they do these really kind of gloomy, dark covers with a murky spaceship in the background. And you're right. To me, as a kid, looking at these books in spinner racks and drugstores, the Ballantine books just jumped out because of the variety, and not just with their science fiction. They did a gimmick series of books, and I can't remember who the ghost editor was. Zacharias Midnight Snacks and this sort of thing.
With Richard Power covers. I think.
Richard Power covers again. They were not anybody under the age of 60 probably has no idea who Zachary is or was, but he was in the 60s. Every locality had its own local horror movie host, because all the local stations around the country realized that all these old movies like Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein were basically free to show. And in the Los Angeles area, an enormously popular host of late night television was some guy, I don't know his name, who dressed up in a costume, called himself Zachary. And he was popular.
Wasn't Zachary? Zachary, I think, was in
New York. He was in New York.
You're thinking of Vampira, probably.
It didn't happen in the Deep South.
The one I grew up.
There's a big difference.
Yeah.
I grew up watching a Kansas City TV station where the guy's name was Gregory Graves.
Yep.
Anyway, the idea, and here in Chicago, it was, God, the guy's still around. But anyway,
Ghoulardi possibly, or Son of Ghoul, or one of
Ghoul.
Ghoulardi.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Is it-
Anyway,
Well, we know what you're doing after the panel. We're watching.
Is so almost on the same thing, but this is another one that was kind of in the 60s. They published this. This is the
That's
first,
true.
yeah, and this was the first of a kind. I mean, this is Bantam had published one or two of the novelizations, but I think this was the first time that anybody took a TV series and did an in-depth look at them. This
Probably.
book stayed in print with many different covers for God knows how long. I mean, at least they must have sold millions of these things. And it became, you know, every kid who was a Star Trek fan had a. This is a first, and I haven't. Again, it's an untouched copy. I think I wore out 2 or 3 copies of this thing when I was a kid, marking it up. And again, in the 70s, they followed on. David Gerald wrote 2 books,
Right.
making a Star Trek, and this was again, it was ahead of its time. Lee, this is one of my favorites. Also, was one of my favorite writers, Lee Brackett.
That's right. I'd forgotten they did that.
Yeah, that was
Steranko covers. Yep.
Steranko.
Yeah.
She revived her Eric John Stark series.
Yeah.
And published 2 of these. I love this cover. I'll fold this one. I could fold out and maybe.
Hounds of Scathe. Yep.
Yeah, Hounds of Scathe. That's Jim Steranko, best known as a Marvel Comics guy. And
I don't have the book downstairs with me. Oh, yep. And was it a trilogy or were there more?
she was at work on the 4th one when she passed away.
I
One of my
just wanted to give Jeff, you typed in what's your favorite book. I don't have it downstairs, but I love the Clark Ashton Smith. There's a bunch of people, the Dunsany books. But if I had to pick one book you had to read, I would try to find the Ballantine adult fantasy anthology called New Worlds for Old.
yeah,
Yeah.
And New Worlds for Old
I got one.
oh yeah, New Worlds for Old had the usual round of suspects that Lynn Carter liked. It had very bejeweled prose. It had Lovecraft in it, all this other stuff. But it had poetry, and it had classical poetry that rhymes, that sings. It started off with Oscar Wilde's The Sphinx, went to George Sterling's Wine for Wizardry, and then had Clark Ashton Smith's The Hashish Eater. This was, and we'll discount the fact that Lynn decided, well, this is such a great anthology, I'm going to put some of my new unpublished novel at the end of it, which he did a lot of in his anthologies. But that said, that is the anthology to get if you really want to get a feel for how the whole series was.
I would have to say my favorite, and I held it up again just a few minutes ago, but again, is Rendezvous with Rama. I mean, this is one of my 2 or 3 favorite SF novels. Actually, I read it when it was serialized in Galaxy. Then I read it when it came out in hardcover, and then I picked up one of the paperbacks. I think I've conservatively read this novel at least a half dozen times. It's one of those that when I feel down, you know, or if I feel like I'm forgetting what science fiction is about. This and another one I don't have here, and I think it's probably my favorite all-time science fiction novel. Period. Gateway by Frederick Pohl, which is also published by Bantam, with a cover that's absolutely gorgeous and has absolutely nothing to do with the book. I think actually we got about 5 more minutes ahead of it. Let's see.
Oh, okay, let's mention my.
Kathy,
I guess I have to. I did part of my dissertation on it, but one of the oddest choices that I don't know where it came from, and I didn't get a chance to ask Betty this, was David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus. One of the strangest fantasy novels ever. It was published in 1920 or 25, something like that. It was a complete failure. Lindsay's whole career was like one failure on top of another. I mean, if you want, Alan, if you want to hear a depressing novelist's career, A Voyage to Arcturus sold 725 copies in its first edition. And that was the best-selling novel he ever wrote. Everyone after that sold less.
Uh,
But the
okay.
odd thing about A Voyage to Arcturus is it's never been out of print since the 20s. The first paperback was the Ballantine paperback, and that's the one that made it kind of the classic it is today. Everybody knows the title, and it was kind of an obscure, weird.
And the cover by Bob Pepper is one of the few covers, according to a correspondent of mine, John Coulthard, who's another great artist. He said it's one of the few covers that actually matches the novel.
It does.
Yeah.
You get to,
that's the one I don't have, but I know where I can get a copy. I think I'm going to take that as a recommendation.
but I would argue.
The Edison, it'll be a little easier, but it's still dense, but it's great.
Yeah. Another one that is a storied book here, and it is the first edition of Ringworld by Larry Niven, and which has gone through many different editions and so forth. This is the edition, the first edition of this is the infamous one where it's got a fundamental mistake in the first chapter, where Niven had, it's hard to explain, but he had the Earth rotating in the wrong direction.
Oh, yeah.
Which for SF writers is one of those mistakes that you wake up in the middle of the night going, oh my God, I hope I never do something like that. And he corrected it. And so every subsequent edition, every subsequent printing, he rewrote the chapter, he got it going in the right direction. But in this first edition here, wrong way. It was another thing was that they did frontispiece illustrations. Again, Niven. They did a uniform series with Rick Sternbach doing them. And the first printings of these things had frontispiece illustrated by Sternbach of Niven's aliens. There's a Kazinti. I think there's, and actually in the back, there's a Kazinti again without his skin on him. And these things stand out. I don't think anybody else. I mean, all the other publishers at one point or another took risks at one of another, but I can't think of another publisher that took risks so consistently and so often and did so many innovations as they did.
And I'm not sure there are that many publishers left. I mean, when not long after they sold to Random House, the adult fantasy series went away. But there are titles, if you look at that list, there are books that nobody knew about before that are now among the most influential. Blood in the Mist, Hope Merlee's novel. We would not have Neil Gaiman without novels like Blood in the Mist, and he cheerfully acknowledges that. Yeah. And I think those books, and Lord Dunsany is another example, became widely known because of the Ballantine editions.
Yeah. You know, I think that's it. I'm going to let you have the last word there because they're telling us that our minute is winding up.
Okay.
And, does anybody have anything else to add on this or whatever? I think not. Patrick and Teresa, we missed you, but sorry, guys. Show up another time. And for everybody who did show up, thank you all for coming. It's been delightful. And hope to see you live next year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's do this again when everybody's actually in the same room.